It started as the kind of favor you agree to without thinking twice. When my neighbor, Diane, asked if I could water her plants while she was in Florida visiting her daughter, I said yes before she even finished the sentence. We'd lived side by side for nearly 20 years, trading sugar, gossip, and occasional baked goods over the fence. She had a lush collection of indoor ferns and flowering pots on the porch, the kind that seemed to thrive under her care, no matter the season. It was early spring, still cool enough that the mornings carried a bite, but the afternoons teased the warmth to come. Diane left me her spare key and a simple list: water the porch plants every other day, mist the orchids in the kitchen, and keep an eye out for any packages. Easy. The first 2 days were uneventful. I'd stroll over in the late morning, key in hand, enjoying the quiet of our cul-de-sac. Inside her house, everything smelled faintly of lavender, the sachets she tucked into every drawer, and the air was still, the kind of stillness you only get in a home that's waiting for someone to come back. I'd water the plants, check the mail, and lock up without a second thought. That Wednesday morning was different. My husband, Daniel, had left early for a supposed meeting across town. He kissed my cheek at 7:15, travel mug in hand, and said he wouldn't be home until late afternoon. I remember because he asked me not to wait on lunch. By 10 o'clock, I decided to take Diane's mail over and give her porch plants a little extra water since the forecast called for a warmer day. The street was quiet, except for a delivery truck 2 doors down. I unlocked her door, stepped inside, and was met by that familiar lavender scent. But as I walked toward the kitchen, my eyes caught on something in the living room, a dark shape on the couch. I stopped. It wasn't there yesterday. It was a leather jacket, not just any leather jacket, Daniel's leather jacket. The same one I'd given him for his birthday 5 years ago, with the worn cuffs and a small scuff near the left pocket from when he brushed against the garage door last winter. I could see it clearly from where I stood, draped over the armrest as if someone had just slipped it off without a second thought. For a moment, I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe he'd dropped something off for Diane, maybe she'd borrowed it for some reason I couldn't fathom. But the air in the room felt different, warmer, like someone had been there just moments before I arrived. I didn't move closer, not yet. Instead, I stood in the doorway, my hand tightening around the mail I still held, the edges of the envelopes digging into my palm. That was the moment, the exact moment when the favor I'd agreed to without thinking became the beginning of something I couldn't ignore. I stepped into the living room, slow and careful, as if sudden movement might change what I was seeing. The morning light spilled through Diane's lace curtains, throwing delicate patterns across the couch cushions. And there it was, Daniel's jacket, lying in the middle of it all like it belonged there. Up close, the leather looked just as I knew it, soft from years of wear, faintly creased along the elbows, the little scratch near the left pocket that no one else would ever notice but me. I reached out without meaning to, my fingers brushing the sleeve. It was still warm. That detail sent a shiver up my spine. If it was warm, it hadn't been here long. I straightened up and looked around. Diane's living room was exactly as it always was. Magazines neatly stacked on the coffee table, a throw blanket folded over the back of the armchair, a vase of fresh tulips on the sideboard. But the air had changed. The lavender sachets couldn't mask the trace of something sharper, something that didn't belong here, Daniel's cologne. My mind started running in 2 directions at once. On one side, the rational voice. Maybe he stopped by to fix something for her. Maybe he needed to use her phone. Maybe there's a perfectly normal reason for this. On the other side, the one that made my pulse quicken, Diane's in Florida. Daniel was supposed to be miles away, tied up in meetings. And yet, somehow, his jacket was here, warm, smelling like him. I forced myself to finish watering the kitchen orchids, though my hands trembled so much I nearly overfilled the pot. My eyes kept darting toward the couch. Every time I looked, it was still there, silent, damning, impossible to explain away without bending reality into shapes I didn't like. Before leaving, I picked up the jacket, folding it neatly and setting it over the arm of the couch. A ridiculous, automatic gesture, as if tidying it might erase the knot in my chest. Then I locked up and stepped back into the cool air outside. Walking home, the street seemed unnaturally still. I kept replaying the morning in my head, Daniel leaving early, the warmth of the leather, the faint cologne. By the time I reached my own front porch, the thought that had been scratching at the edges of my mind settled in fully. This wasn't random. Jackets don't wander into other people's houses on their own. Inside, I hung up my coat, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing. Part of me wanted to march into the garage, call him, and demand an explanation. But another part, the quieter, steadier part, told me to wait. If there was something to find, I'd find it, and I'd do it without tipping my hand. Daniel came home just after 6, the garage door rumbling beneath the hum of the evening news. I was at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables, the sound of the knife steady, controlled. When he stepped inside, he smelled faintly of sawdust and motor oil, his usual shield. But under that, I swore I caught the same note of cologne I'd breathed in at Diane's. "Long day?" I asked without looking up. "Yeah, meetings ran late," he said, dropping his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. The clink sounded louder than usual in the quiet. I dried my hands on a dish towel, glancing toward him just in time to see him rub the back of his neck, his old tell when he was buying time. "Where'd you end up working today?" He poured himself a glass of water before answering. "Mostly at the site on Birch Avenue. You know, the one near the old feed store?" I nodded slowly. Birch Avenue was nowhere near Cedar Hill. I murmured, as if the comment were just idle conversation. "Funny, I thought you said this morning you'd be over by Lakeshore." He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Did I? Guess I mixed it up. He sipped his water, avoiding my eyes. I turned back to the cutting board, keeping my voice light. "Oh, and by the way, I stopped at Diane's today to water her plants. Place looks nice. Smelled different." He glanced up from his glass. "Different?" "Yeah," I said, sliding the chopped carrots into a bowl. "Lavender, of course, but there was something else too. Familiar." His jaw tightened ever so slightly. Probably just her cleaning products. I smiled faintly, but inside I was cataloging every micro-expression, every delay, every unnecessary word. Maybe. Over dinner, he told me about a new client, the rising cost of materials, and how traffic had been awful on the way home. It all sounded rehearsed, like lines he'd practiced in the car. I listened, nodding where appropriate, storing away each piece of his story for later comparison. That night, after he fell asleep, I lay staring at the ceiling. The hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock in the hallway felt louder than they should. I thought about the warmth of the jacket, the way it had been placed, not tossed, not forgotten, but set down with a kind of comfort that said, "I belong here." If I confronted him now, he'd have room to adjust his story, to erase traces I hadn't found yet. No, I needed patience. I needed proof he couldn't spin into something harmless. In the darkness, I decided on my next step. The jacket wasn't the end of the trail. It was the beginning. And if Daniel was going to lie to me, I was going to let him, just long enough to hang himself with his own rope. 2 days later, I went back to Diane's house. It was late afternoon, the golden light spilling over the rooftops of our quiet street. I'd chosen to go later on purpose, curious to see if the rhythm of that still house might change. The spare key Diane had left me always hung in the ceramic dish by the door, pointed down exactly how I'd placed it from the very first day. But that afternoon, when I picked it up, it was turned upward. Such a tiny detail, easy to overlook. But I wasn't someone who overlooked details anymore. I slid the key into the lock, turned it, and stepped inside. Immediately, the air felt different. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the silence. A fresh kind of silence, like the kind a room holds right after someone's left. The magazines on the coffee table weren't stacked the way I'd left them. The blue-covered one was now on top, though I clearly remembered the red one being there last time. In the kitchen, the dish towel hung on the opposite side of the oven handle, things that don't move on their own. I made my way to the plants, misting the orchids as instructed, but my focus wasn't on them. My eyes drifted to corners, to the slightly shifted rug, the armchair angled just a touch differently. I moved through the house the way someone might walk through a crime scene, mentally photographing every detail. In the kitchen sink, there were 2 mugs. One was Diane's, white with painted tulips. The other was plain, solid white, unremarkable except for the lipstick mark in a warm coral shade. Not Diane's color, and definitely not mine. I stepped closer. The lipstick still had a sheen to it, fresh. My fingers curled against the edge of the counter. I thought of Daniel's jacket, the trace of his cologne, the way he'd looked away when I mentioned the house smelling different. The pieces were starting to form a picture, and it wasn't one I wanted to see. Before leaving, I made a deliberate move. I placed a small, empty envelope in the center of the coffee table, tilted slightly. It hadn't been there before. To most people, it would mean nothing. But if someone came back and moved it, I'd know. A silent test. I locked up, turned the key downward in the dish like always, and stepped back outside. As I walked down the porch steps, a car turned the corner at the end of the street. I couldn't see who was driving. Back home, I wrote down every detail: the key's position, the coral lipstick mug, the magazines out of order, the shifted rug, the unfamiliar car. My list was growing faster than I wanted to admit. It wasn't about suspicion anymore. It was only a matter of time before I had certainty. I went back to Diane's the next morning under the guise of chucking the mail early. In truth, I wanted to see if my envelope had been moved. The key was in the same downward position I'd left it, but as soon as I stepped inside, I knew. The air felt lived in again. Not just the lavender sachets Diane favored, but the faintest trace of Daniel's cologne. Sharp, clean, unmistakable. The envelope I'd placed in the middle of the coffee table was gone. My eyes scanned the room. It hadn't fallen. It hadn't blown off. There was no draft in here. Someone had removed it. I took my time, pretending to fuss with the plants, but I was searching, looking for something left behind, something they hadn't thought to hide. It was on the coffee table, tucked under one of Diane's heavy ceramic coasters. A small, folded piece of paper, the edges crinkled as if it had been handled more than once. I slid it free and opened it with careful fingers. Inside, a single line in handwriting I knew better than my own. Next time, let's make it longer. No name, no date, but the handwriting was Daniel's. The same looping D, the same heavy downward stroke on the T. I stood there, my pulse steady now, almost cold. This wasn't a misplaced jacket. This wasn't an innocent visit. It was intimacy in ink. I slipped the note into my pocket and walked through the rest of the house. In the kitchen, the mug with coral lipstick was gone, replaced by 2 freshly washed cups on the drying rack. But a faint ring of lipstick still clung to the rim of the tulip mug, a ghost of last time's carelessness. I checked the position of the armchair, the magazines, the dish towel. Everything had been restored to its usual order. 2 perfect, which meant someone had been here trying to erase their presence. Before leaving, I placed another marker, this time a teaspoon angled strangely in the sugar bowl, subtle enough that only I would notice. I locked up, key down, and walked home, the note burning in my pocket like a live coal. That night, over dinner, I decided to test him. "I ran into a neighbor today," I said casually, spearing a green bean with my fork. "They mentioned seeing someone in Diane's driveway yesterday." Daniel didn't look up from his plate. "Probably a delivery." "A delivery in a leather jacket?" I asked, my tone light. His fork paused midair for half a second. "Could have been anyone." I smiled faintly. "Could have." When he went to shower, I pulled the note from my pocket and placed it in my notebook beneath the heading Evidence. The jacket had been a whisper. The note was a shout. And I wasn't going to let either be forgotten. From that moment on, I became two women. To Daniel, I was the same wife he'd always known. Predictable, warm enough, busying myself with errands and chores. I smiled when he came home, asked about his day, and even laughed at his jokes, though the sound felt hollow in my chest. But behind that facade, I was a recorder, cataloging every glance, every unexplained delay, every scent that didn't belong in our home. The key to getting what I needed was simple: make him believe I still trusted him, because trust makes people sloppy. I started small. The next time he mentioned a job across town, I nodded without question and even offered to pack him lunch. He seemed almost relieved, the kind of relief that told me he'd been bracing for suspicion. That afternoon, instead of going to the grocery store like I said I would, I drove past Diane's house. No jacket on the couch this time, no open curtains, but there was a faint shadow moving in the kitchen, too tall to be Diane's cleaning lady, too broad-shouldered. I didn't knock. I didn't want him to know I was anywhere near. I kept driving, memorizing the time, 2:14 p.m. That night, Daniel was in a talkative mood, telling me about a complicated client and how much time the job was taking. I made a point of offering sympathy, leaning across the counter to touch his hand. It was almost theatrical, a scene we'd both played before, back when I meant it. While he showered, I slipped into the garage and opened the side compartment of his work truck. Inside, beneath a tangle of old receipts, was a small bottle of Diane's favorite wine, unopened. I didn't touch it, didn't take it. I simply noted its presence and the date, then closed everything exactly as I'd found it. The next morning, I went back to Diane's to water the plants. My teaspoon marker in the sugar bowl had been moved, the spoon now resting perfectly aligned with the handle of the jar. They were tidying up after themselves, but not well enough. On the coffee table, a single strand of hair gleamed in the sunlight. Not mine, not Diane's. Too dark, too long. I picked it up with a tissue and sealed it in an envelope. Evidence. By the end of the week, my notebook had grown thicker. The note under the coaster, the lipstick-marked mug, the wine in Daniel's truck, the moved teaspoon, the hair from the coffee table. On the outside, I was the wife who trusted him. On the inside, I was building a case brick by brick, waiting for the day I'd set it down in front of him and watch the lie collapse. Patience, I reminded myself as I slipped the envelope into my desk drawer. Patience is the sharpest weapon. The next time I saw Diane's name light up on Daniel's phone, I was standing at the sink rinsing vegetables. He was in the garage, music playing low, and the phone vibrated against the kitchen counter twice before going still. I dried my hands slowly, watching the screen fade to black. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I'd already memorized the number of rings, the pattern of calls. When he came in, I let the conversation unfold naturally. "Diane called earlier," I said, casual, almost bored. His hand froze briefly on the fridge handle. "Oh, must have been about the gutters. I offered to check them for her." I nodded as if I accepted that completely. "Nice of you." It was the first trap of the evening. Not the words, but the absence of challenge. People expect suspicion. Remove it, and they get reckless. 2 days later, I set another. I texted Diane myself. Just watered the plants, everything's fine. She replied within minutes, "Thanks, dear, appreciate it." An hour later, Daniel mentioned offhand that he'd stopped by Diane's to make sure the lock on her back door was secure. I smiled faintly, stirring the pot on the stove. Good, I was just there earlier, didn't notice anything wrong. He didn't answer. The more I did it, slipped tiny, mismatched facts into conversation, the more I saw it. That half-second flicker in his eyes, the pause before he adjusted his story, the faint tightening of his jaw. He was editing himself in real time. On my next visit to Diane's, I found nothing overt. The teaspoon was in the sugar bowl again. My marker returned to its wrong position. I moved it back. If they wanted to erase traces, I'd give them new ones to erase. When I returned home, Daniel was in the living room flipping through a magazine. "You were gone a while," he said. "Stopped to talk to the mailman," I replied smoothly. "He mentioned seeing your truck over on Cedar Hill last week. Said it's been parked there a few times." Daniel's gaze lifted slowly from the page. Probably another black pickup, lots of them around. I tilted my head, smiling as though I agreed. True, easy to mistake one for another. That night, lying beside him in the dark, I listened to the subtle shift in his breathing as he fell asleep. My mind was wide awake, running the reel of every slip, every micro-expression. The satisfaction wasn't in catching him, it was in knowing he didn't realize the game had already started. I wasn't confronting him, not yet. I was dismantling the scaffolding of his lies piece by piece, until the whole thing collapsed with him still standing on top of it. And when it fell, it would be in front of both of them. It was a Tuesday morning when the opportunity came, the kind that looks like coincidence but feels like it's been waiting for you. Daniel left just after 8, claiming he had to pick up some materials before heading to a job site. I knew from the casualness in his tone that it was one of those days. I waited 15 minutes, then grabbed Diane's spare key and headed out. Her driveway was empty, but that didn't mean much. Daniel was cautious enough to park somewhere nearby if he didn't want the truck seen. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, careful to let it close without a sound. The house wasn't empty. It was the voices that froze me in place, faint but distinct, coming from the back room that Diane used as a den. I stayed in the hallway, close enough to catch the words without giving myself away. "We just have to be careful," Daniel's voice said, low but steady. "She's not stupid, but she trusts too easily. As long as we keep it quiet until she signs, there's nothing she can do." Diane's laugh followed, sharper than I'd ever heard it. "She won't question you. She's been married to you so long she thinks you'd—" She let the sentence trail off, but her meaning was clear. "Exactly," he said. "Once the papers are in front of her, she'll think it's routine. She won't even look." A pause, then the scrape of a chair. I could picture him leaning back, that self-satisfied tilt to his mouth. By the time she realizes what happened, it'll be too late. I felt my nails dig into my palm, but I didn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to step in, to rip the curtain off their smug little scheme. But the smarter part of me, the part that had been waiting, gathering, planning, told me to stay still. They were giving me exactly what I needed. Diane's voice dropped lower. "And after that, you're sure she won't fight?" "She won't," he said, confident. "She's never been the type. She avoids conflict. That's what makes this easy." My heart thudded, but my breathing stayed slow. I stepped back, each footfall silent on the hallway carpet, retracing my steps to the front door. I slipped outside, letting the latch click softly into place. From the porch, their voices were muffled again, just background noise. I walked away with the measured pace of someone who'd heard nothing at all. But inside, every word was burning itself into memory, ready to be written down in my notebook under a new heading, direct admission. They thought I wouldn't hear them. They thought I wouldn't fight. They just handed me the proof that both were wrong. By the time I got home, the words I'd overheard were already transcribed in my mind, each phrase set down exactly as they'd spoken it. I didn't even take my coat off before opening my notebook. Direct admission. I wrote it at the top of the page in thick, deliberate letters. Underneath, I listed the date, time, and location, then laid out the conversation line by line, just as I'd heard it. I described the tone, the pauses, the smug certainty in their voices. I wasn't just collecting evidence anymore. I was building a case so tight that even if they tried to twist it, there'd be no room to breathe. I went to my desk drawer and pulled out the other pieces. The coral lipstick mug, photographed before it was washed. The handwritten note under the coaster. The wine bottle from Daniel's truck, now photographed and returned to its hiding spot. The single dark hair sealed in an envelope. The log of every time his truck had been near Diane's street, matched against his work schedule. I spread them across the table in neat rows, each one a brick in the wall I was building. Still, I wanted more. A direct connection between the two of them outside of Diane's house. Something that would take away any room for innocent explanations. That afternoon, I called a law office in the next town over, a place far enough away that Daniel would never think to connect it to me. I spoke to a woman named Marlene, explained I was preparing for a potential divorce and needed to secure my assets before anything could be moved or sold. Her voice was calm, precise. If you have proof of collusion between your husband and a third party, we can leverage that to your advantage in both asset division and potential fraud claims. I told her I was close to having that proof. She told me to keep collecting, but not to tip my hand. Let them get comfortable, she said. Comfort breeds mistakes. That became my mantra. Over the next few days, I added smaller details to my file. Receipts from shops near Diane's, withdrawals from our joint account that matched her neighborhood's ATMs, timestamps from calls saved under E in Daniel's phone. I began to see the pattern, and with it, their overconfidence. They were meeting more frequently, staying longer. Whatever they were planning, they thought the clock was still in their control. They had no idea I was the one holding the stopwatch. By Friday night, I had enough to act. Not just suspicion, not just circumstantial clues. I had a map of their movements, a script of their intentions, and physical evidence to tie it all together. Now, all that was left was to choose the moment and make sure it landed like a hammer. I chose a Saturday morning. People let their guard down on weekends. They move slower, speak more casually, think they have time to recover from surprises. The setup was simple, a text to Diane the day before. Found some old papers of Mom's, might belong to you. Better to hand them over in person. She replied in minutes, sure, what time? I told her 10 a.m. Daniel didn't know she was coming. He thought our only plans involved the gardener arriving at 9. I brewed coffee, laid out a dusty folder on the kitchen counter with nothing inside but old sewing patterns. Props matter. At 9:58, the crunch of tires on gravel. Diane stepped inside, smiled just a little too bright. I didn't know you'd be here, she said to Daniel. I didn't know you were coming, he replied. Perfect, I said, locking the door behind her. Saves me explaining twice. Before either of them could answer, the doorbell rang. Daniel opened it and froze. My lawyer, Marlene, stepped in, her leather case tucked under one arm. Good morning, she said, her voice clipped and professional. Let's get started. Diane's brow furrowed. Started with what? I took my seat at the table, motioning for Marlene to open her case. This, I said, this is where you both realize I've been listening and documenting. One by one, Marlene laid out the evidence. The handwritten note in Daniel's script, next time, let's make it longer. The photo of the coral lipstick mug, the wine bottle from his truck, the hair sealed in an envelope, the list of times his truck was spotted near Diane's street, and finally, the transcript of the conversation I'd overheard, word for word, detailing how they'd have me sign away my own assets. Daniel's face went pale, his jaw tightening. "Olivia," "No," I cut in, my voice sharp. 37 years of marriage, and you thought I wouldn't notice. That my loyalty was stupidity, that my age was a weakness. Diane crossed her arms, her voice brittle. "You're twisting things." I leaned forward, my eyes on hers. Twisting? No. Untangling. There's a difference. Marlene slid the final document across the table. "As of this morning, all marital assets are under legal protection. Any attempt to transfer or sell will be blocked. We're also prepared to pursue fraud and conspiracy charges if necessary." Daniel's voice dropped to that cold, measured tone I used to mistake for control. "You'd ruin me like this?" I met his gaze. "You ruined yourself when you decided I was disposable." Then I turned to Diane. "And you thought youth made you untouchable. It doesn't. It just makes you impatient, and impatience leaves evidence." Silence stretched in the room. I gathered the papers back into Marlene's case, stood, and walked to the door. "You both wanted to leave me with nothing but my memories," I said, pausing with my hand on the handle. "The good news? The best ones don't have either of you in them." I stepped out into the morning air, the sound of their silence following me like a victory march.